I'm Monica from Pattern Poole. This is our Leafy Sea Dragon applique pattern, and in this video I'm going to show you how to stitch around the edge of your applique shapes using your built-in embroidery stitches on your sewing machine. To be able to sew the decorative stitches on your sewing machine, you're definitely going to need a firm base. So I have put a piece of medium weight tearaway underneath, and then I'm using rayon machine embroidery threads. I have bobbin fill in my bobbin. I'm using a size 75 machine embroidery needle, and I'm also going to use my open toe foot to provide clear vision so I can see where I'm sewing. So definitely set yourself up with a scrap of your background fabric and a piece of tearaway underneath, and that way you'll be able to practice your stitches first of all. You just want to make sure that your top tension is a little bit looser, say about between 2 and 3, maybe even lower. But you want to make sure that you don't have any of the bobbin thread coming to the top. And on the back of your stitch, you really want to be able to see a little bit of the top thread coming through to the underneath so that you have a nice, thick, full stitch. So the first stitch I'm going to start sewing with is this stitch here. I call this a grass stitch, and it's smooth on one edge, so it's going to be smooth on the outer edge of the applique shape, and it's jagged on the inside edge. So these are my top tips for using decorative stitches on your sewing machine. Number 1, make sure that you use either an open toe foot or a foot that is purposely made for decorative stitches. Now these feet have got a groove underneath them, and therefore they slide easily across or glide easily over the top of your stitches, which are slightly raised, and it's going to prevent your stitch from bunching up. Number 2, make sure that you use the correct needle. So I recommend a size 75 machine embroidery needle, and the reason for this is that your embroidery needle is nice and sharp because we're doing lots of stitches close together, and also it's got a slightly larger eye so that your embroidery threads will glide through nicely and you'll have less breakages. 3, make sure you use a good quality machine embroidery thread. Number 4, make sure you use a medium weight tearaway. So tearaway is that white product that can tear in both directions, because after you have finished stitching, and you need a really nice firm base to be able to sew your embroidery stitches on so that it's not going to bunch up, and you are then going to want to remove that from the back of your work once you have finished stitching. Number 5, make sure you don't push or pull on your work as it's going through the machine. Let the machine take it through at its own pace, and that way you won't distort any of the stitches. Number 6, make sure you find your machine manual. Every machine is different, so you're going to need to refer to it when you're seeing how to use your stitches, how to change the length, how to change the width. You can play with your stitches, so make sure you do get that sample piece ready so that you can have a play with your stitches, stitch them out, see what's going to work for you. And as I said, every machine's different, so you may not have the stitches that I'm going to use, but you may be able to find something that's similar and create your own unique textile art. So you can see I've started stitching around the major body pieces using the grass stitch, and I'm just going to come down to the tail here and show you how I'm going to stitch this. Now, you could start with long threads and pull them off to the back when you have finished stitching the piece. I'm going to use my little trick that I like to use, where my machine has got thread cutters on it, so I just start with that short thread. I'm going to put my needle just in the very outside edge there like that, and I've got a tie-off stitch set, so it does a couple of stitches and it ties off, but as it stitches it pulls that thread through to the back. Now that's okay because I'm using a dark background. If you're using a white background, sometimes your threads can show through, so you may want to do the trick where you pull it through to the back and tie off. So I'm just making sure that my straight edge is going to be stitching just on the outside edge of my shape. And when you're sewing with this grass stitch, it's actually a little bit similar to when you're sewing with a satin stitch. So please check out our video which shows all 3 different methods to stitching around applique shapes. So it's the same as a satin stitch. What you do when you're sewing along, you can just stitch along, but then when you feel that you need to actually turn your work, if you can't just glide it there, you may get to a point where it's like, okay, I really need to stop now. Now the trick with this is when you are sewing an inside curve, so this is like a concave curve, what you would do is you actually stop with your needle on the inside edge. and pivot slightly. So I'm stopping slightly and pivoting. Now the reason why I do that is because if I was to stop with my needle on the outside edge and pivot, just sort of thinking about that, if I stopped there and pivoted, I'd be actually opening up the stitch and making a little V shape. So I want to stop with my needle on the inside edge and pivot slightly. So I'm approaching a corner, and to sew my corner, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way up to the corner, and I'm going to stop with my needle on the outside edge. And I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to pivot. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to raise my needle, and this is a little trick so that I'm not going to have stitching outside of my shape where I don't want it. So I'm going to just bring my needle, I've actually just shifted forward slightly. Now when my needle goes down, it's actually stitching into the actual stitching that I've just previously done. And now I'm going to just continue sewing on to my curved edge. Now on this side here, I've got what I call my outside curve, or that's my convex curve. But if I say that's an outside curve, it means what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop. When I need to pivot, I'm going to stop with my needle on the outside edge. And the reason for that is that if I pivot slightly like that, I'll be stitching a little bit over the top of the stitching I've done, rather than if I stop with my needle on the inside edge, I'd be opening up a V-shape opening. Okay, so to finish off, all you'll do is just overlap where you started slightly. Just like that. And if you didn't have a tie-off function on your machine, you would actually pull the work out from your machine. You'd have long threads, you'd tie them off to the back, just as I show in our other video. But what I'm going to do is I've actually set my machine up. Check and see if your machine book has got this function. But what I'm going to do is I actually set my machine so it ties off the thread with some tiny stitches, and then it cuts the thread and pulls the thread off to the back. So this is what it looks like on the back of your work. So I'm just going to continue on now, stitching all of the main body pieces using this grass stitch. So the next stitch I'm going to use is very similar to the first one, only it's shaggy on both edges. So I'm going to call this one the Shaggy Stitch, and I've used this on all of the larger outer bluey green aqua pieces. To start sewing this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my foot, and I'm going to line up the center of the foot on the very edge of the applique piece. And then when I start sewing, what's going to happen is it's going to sew some, or basically half, onto the applique shape, and the other half goes onto the outer edge, and that's how you get that nice shaggy stitch. When you're sewing curves, it'll be the same thing. So on an inner curve, just stop with the needle on the inner edge, just to maneuver your way around the curve. And then when I go to sew the corner, I just sew all the way to the outside edge of the corner. I stop with my needle on the outside edge, or the right side edge, and then I'm just going to pivot. But as this stitch is very shaggy, you never know where the needle is going to end up. I lift the foot, or lift the needle and lift the foot, and then I just come in a little bit on the edge, and I'm going to start sewing again now. You can't really go wrong with this stitch because it is, it's not a neat stitch, it's a nice shaggy stitch. But now I'm going to sew on my outside curve, so I'm stopping with my needle on the outside edge and then stitching away. So just always making sure, as far as possible, that the center of my foot is on the center of the applique shape. So once again, to finish off this stitch, just overlap slightly where you started, and either pull long threads to the back or finish off with a tie-up or a locking stitch. And I'm using my thread cutters that pulls the threads down to the underneath of the work. So here's our Leafy Sea Dragon all finished. I decided to finish off the rest of the pieces using a satin stitch. So you can see how to do satin stitch in our Kev the Koala YouTube clip. Hope you enjoyed watching our video and we'll see you next time.